Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. The India-Canada tension is rising. Today, India stopped issuing visas to Canadians. In fact, Justin Trudeau is facing intense scrutiny. He's yet to provide proof for the charges that he made against India. Meanwhile, more gang violence has been reported in Canada. Another Khalistani wanted in India has been killed. We'll bring you the updates and talk about India's assertive foreign policy. Trudeau wanted America to condemn India. But guess what the US has said this week? They're talking to India to build weapon systems here. In other news, Poland says it won't give any more weapons to Ukraine. We'll tell you how Zelensky upset one of Kiev's strongest allies. The Saudi crown prince says normalization with Israel is getting closer, but conditions apply. Iran has passed a new hijab law, in fact. Women face up to 10 years in jail for dress code violations. What is Syrian President Assad doing in China? Why olive oil worth hundreds of thousands of dollars is being stolen in Spain? And why Google Maps is being sued for the death of a man in the US? All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in the US. His meeting with President Biden will focus on securing more weapons from America. Zelensky says air defense is priority as Russia hits Ukraine with a barrage of missiles. Kiev says it shot down over 35 missiles fired by Moscow. Pakistan to hold general elections in the last week of January next year, 2024. They were due to be held in November this year, but the poll panel says it needs more time to redraw constituencies after the latest census. Pakistan's parliament was dissolved in August. Since then, a caretaker government has been in charge. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak defends his climate policy shift. The Sunak government has delayed targets aimed at achieving net zero carbon emissions. The UK Prime Minister called the shift pragmatic. The move comes as British voters are facing a severe cost of living crisis. Indonesia jails a woman for reciting an Islamic prayer before trying pork. The TikToker has been handed a 2-year prison sentence for blasphemy. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim nation. Pork is forbidden under Islam. And the Game of Thrones author sues ChatGPT owner OpenAI. George Martin, John Grisham, and Jonathan Franzen are among the authors who filed a lawsuit. They accuse ChatGPT of copyright violation. OpenAI is already facing lawsuits by many artists and coders. On Monday, Canada started a fight with India. Justin Trudeau stood up in their parliament. He spoke about the death of a Khalistani terrorist. He tried to lay the blame at India's doorstep and expelled an Indian diplomat. New Delhi reacted with fury. In a tit-for-tat move, it expelled a Canadian diplomat. Then Trudeau sought help from his allies. He wanted a statement of condemnation. The move boomeranged. Instead of support, he got a question. Where is the proof of India's involvement? And 3 days later, Trudeau's strategy is unraveling. He was hoping to corner India, but with his stunts, he's painted himself in a corner. Take a look at this.
Prime Minister, India has rejected your allegations.
That was Justin Trudeau at the United Nations General Assembly avoiding questions about India, but he cannot avoid the scrutiny. India made a bold decision today. It suspended visa services for Canadians, meaning Canadian citizens cannot apply for an Indian visa now. The decision was made public this afternoon. There was no press release. The applicants found out online. India engages a visa service provider for Canada, a company called BLS. They take the applications on India's behalf. BLS collects the filled forms and delivers them to the Indian mission. Here, a visa officer reviews them and takes the final call on whether someone should get a visa or not. That is the procedure. Now, BLS has stopped taking any more applications. Their website has a flash. This is what it says. Important notice from Indian mission due to operational reasons with effect from 21st September 2023. Indian visa services have been suspended till further notice. Later in the evening, Indian officials spoke about this. There was a formal statement. It came from India's External Affairs Ministry. It said Indian diplomats in Canada are under threat. So they're facing operational difficulties, which is why they closed the visa services. And just like that, India shut its doors on Canadians. How many come to India? In 2021, about 80,000 Canadians visited. Before the pandemic, the number was around 300,000, 3 lakh people in a year. Will Ottawa respond in kind? As of this evening, there was no announcement. But we won't be surprised if they do. Diplomacy, you see, works on reciprocity. If India makes the visa process easier for Canada, Canada responds in kind, usually. If one side cancels visa services, a reprisal is almost certain. You may recall what happened on Monday. When Trudeau went public with his charge, Ottawa asked a senior Indian diplomat to leave. India responded in kind. A Canadian diplomat in New Delhi was also asked to leave. And in the days ahead, more Canadian diplomats could leave India. Not because India has asked them to, but because Canada says they're adjusting their diplomatic staff. It claims that they've received threats on social media. Canadians have received threats on social media, and the Canadian mission wrote about this to the government of India. Reports say they want additional security. But what about the security of Indian diplomats in Canada? They face threats from Khalistani groups all the time. You may remember what happened in July. Posters were being circulated in Canada. They had photos of Indian diplomats with words like "Kill India." And who was behind these posters? Khalistanis, the supporters of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the sanctioned terrorist who was killed in June. The one for whose murder Canada blames India. Nijjar was part of a separatist campaign. They were holding referendums in Canada asking for a separate Sikh state to be carved out of India. He was shot in the month of June. Indian diplomats were threatened in July. And when did Canada respond to these threats? In August. They took a whole month to respond when the safety and security of Indian diplomats was at risk. They released a statement promising to keep all Indian diplomats safe. But they're not safe. Today, India complained about their safety once again. So little has changed. And behind the scenes, New Delhi is talking tough. Reports say Indian officials have spoken to their Canadian counterparts. On the death of Nijjar, India has asked for proof. What about joining the Canadian investigation? Will India join it? They're yet to take a call. They want to see what kind of proof Canada comes up with. Now, one thing is clear. India and Canada are on a collision course. The diplomatic relationship has more or less collapsed. This is Trudeau's train wreck. Meanwhile, more stories of his India visit are coming out. It was a disaster. Apparently, before Trudeau flew into India, the Indian side had made some arrangements, just like they did for all other leaders. India offered Trudeau the best hospitality. A presidential suite was booked for him in a 5-star hotel in New Delhi. But guess what? Trudeau refused to stay there. Instead, he asked for a different room, a smaller room. We don't know why. Then Trudeau's plane broke down. You know about that. His plane broke down. New Delhi offered the Air India One to fly him back to Canada. Now, this plane, Air India One, ferries India's president, vice president, and the prime minister. It's the best that India has, and Trudeau was offered the same plane as a goodwill gesture. Again, he refused. He chose to remain stranded in Delhi for 2 days. He left only when his own plane was fixed. Why did Trudeau refuse Indian hospitality? Was it out of precaution? Was it because he knew that he would be picking a fight with India? Or was he afraid that he'll be snooped upon? We don't know, and Canada has not bothered to explain. They're busy frying bigger fish at the moment. Another gang war in Canada. Another killing has been reported. A gangster has been shot dead. His name is Sukhdev Singh Gill. He was shot in Canada's Winnipeg. Gill too was wanted in India. India's National Investigation Agency, NIA, was looking for him, and he faced some serious charges like extortion and murder. So who killed Sukhdev Singh Gill? A rival gang has taken responsibility, and this has been a trend in Canada, the increasing incidence of gang violence. In 2021, there was a big surge. More than 700 homicides were reported, 700. A quarter of these murders were related to gang wars. This is the highest number of killings related to gangs in the last 16 years, and that is the story of Canada. Appeasement of terrorists and separatists leading to a growing crime rate, and their Prime Minister picking a fight with India over the death of a Khalistani. What about the efforts to catch Niger's killers? Canada says the investigation is on, and at this rate, they're beginning to sound like a broken record. So the message from New Delhi is clear. Come with proof or do not bother. But how will Canada take it? So far, their strategy has been aggressive. Do first, think later. That's what they're doing. Maybe Trudeau was hoping the pressure will get to India, that New Delhi will cave. But he was mistaken. India has reacted very sharply to Justin Trudeau's allegations, a sort of no-nonsense response. Instead of going on the back foot, India is taking a step forward. There are two parts to this response. One, a complete denial. When you deny something, you can do two things. You can either say you are mistaken, or you can say you are lying. India is choosing the second option. New Delhi is not just saying that Trudeau is mistaken, they're saying that he is politically motivated. Listen to this.
Yes, I do think there is a degree of prejudice here, They have made the allegations, they have taken action on them. To us, it seems or it appears that these allegations by the Government of Canada are primarily politically driven.
The second part of the response is taking the fight to Canada, meaning it's not tit for tat anymore, it's about making the first move. Now consider the visa suspension. Canada has not stopped issuing visas to Indians, not yet. So India's decision was not a response, it was the first move. Put together, what do these strategies reveal? An aggressive foreign policy. Frankly, there is no other way to respond. Just think about it. India has handed over, in fact, multiple dossiers to Canada. Dossiers on wanted Khalistanis, their names, their pictures, their crime, all of it. Everything has been detailed in these files that have been given to Canada. We're talking about concrete evidence. And what has Canada done with it? Absolutely nothing. Yet the same Canada expects India to act with zero evidence. How is that fair? India has firmly called out this double standard. It's a sign of New Delhi's assertive foreign policy. We saw that on Ukraine too, and we're seeing it on Canada. Now, I know what you're thinking. India hasn't picked a side in the Ukraine war. How is that assertive? Well, assertive doesn't always mean picking sides. It can also mean picking yourself. And that's what India has done. The West has dangled many carrots in front of New Delhi: weapons, nuclear cooperation, lavish state visits. Yet India has refused to change its position. And that's called being assertive, putting your national interest over everything else. Same with Canada. India knows how dangerous the Khalistan movement is. We know what happened in the 1970s and 80s. We also know that the movement is dead in India. But it's important to keep it that way. Countries like Canada are home to the dying embers of Khalistan. Instead of putting it out, Trudeau is fanning it. He is linking it to freedom of expression, and that's a national security risk for India, because Khalistanis are free to organize and operate in Canada. So what's the obvious next step? Plotting attacks. In fact, some Khalistanis have already started threatening Indians in Canada. How long before they act on it? So it is important to call Trudeau out, to question his dangerous politics. But I must also say it's a risky strategy. Canada is a key Western partner. It is a treaty ally of the United States. If you take on Canada, you're taking on the West. So why is New Delhi doing this? Because India finds itself in a sweet spot. Western nations are increasingly focusing on the Indo-Pacific. They see China as a big challenge. And what has India done? Use this new equation to its advantage. Let me explain how. Canada's role in geopolitics has been shrinking. It's an aging economy, plus it's often taken for granted. The West does not even have to convince Canada for most things. They're usually already on board. India is quite different, though. It is the fifth largest economy of the world. It is a nuclear power. And it's not hesitant to rebuff the West. We saw that in Ukraine. And this makes India strategically tricky. The West can count on Canada's support on most issues, but they cannot count on India or take it for granted. Because New Delhi is not bound by their treaty alliances. India follows national interest, and don't mistake this sweet spot for luck. This is the result of decades of foreign policy and economic growth. Credit must also go to Indian politicians, opposition or government. They agree on foreign policy. There is continuity. They agree on national interest. Take these two examples, Ukraine and Canada. Both the opposition and the government in India are on the same page, and this gives the leadership a lot of confidence, a lot of freedom to stand their ground. Canada, it seems, is learning that the hard way. You know why Trudeau's offensive is failing? Because he's not getting the support that he was betting on. He was hoping that the US would condemn India. The US did issue statements. But what did they say? One of the statements came from the Pentagon. That's the American Defense Ministry, the Pentagon. A senior official spoke about India. He said the US is in active talks with India. Talks about what? America plans to make weapon systems in India. The two sides are working on an agreement, a deal to streamline their defense partnership, to make the supply of weapons easier and to bring the defense firms of both India and the US closer. So what kind of weapons can America make in India? The plan is yet to be finalized, but broadly, 4 areas hold promise: intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and weapons for ground-based conventional warfare. The Pentagon is looking at the big picture. China is a serious challenge, and the US needs India to counter it. Let me quote, in fact. Our belief is that getting the US-India relationship right is not just necessary, it is essential to achieving our strategy in the Indo-Pacific. There's a broad and deep commitment to making that happen. Let me repeat a part of it. The relationship is not just necessary, it is essential. That is the message from the Pentagon. The shift is clear. Its foundations were laid earlier this year when Prime Minister Modi visited the United States. A series of big-ticket defense deals were sealed, including the deal on fighter jet engines, and the drone agreement. There was a special emphasis on tech transfer, also on manufacturing weapons in India. And expect the momentum to carry into 2024 because Joe Biden could be visiting India again. He's been invited as a chief guest for India's Republic Day. Prime Minister Modi has extended the invite personally. They met earlier this month. Biden was in New Delhi for the G20, as you know. He met Prime Minister Modi at his official residence. This was just a day before the Leaders' Summit. The White House is yet to confirm whether Biden will attend. The plan is still being worked out. Reports say India is also talking with other Quad partners, Australia and Japan. Next year, India will host the Quad Summit. So if Australia and Japan agree, their leaders could join Biden in New Delhi. They too could attend India's Republic Day. So the trend is clear, a stronger partnership and new synergies. Let me give you an example. Last year on the 9th of December, Indian and Chinese troops clashed on the border. The confrontation happened in the Tawang sector. This is in Arunachal Pradesh. It is an Indian state, but China stakes claim on it. It says Arunachal Pradesh belongs to China. So on that day, December 9, Chinese troops showed up. They came with spiked clubs and tasers, clearly looking to attack. But India's reinforcements took them by surprise. India repelled the Chinese troops. Reports say the PLA was caught off guard. It was almost as if Indian soldiers knew that they were coming. So the Indian side was prepared. And the US had a role to play here. The US military had shared real-time intelligence. They'd been tracking the PLA's movements for weeks. The US saw the Chinese troops conducting drills or test exercises, as they called them. This was in preparation for the offensive. The PLA wanted to test Indian defenses. They were looking to gain a foothold by entering Indian territory. The US put together all of this intelligence. Positions of Chinese soldiers were identified, pictures were taken through satellites, and the US relayed all of this information to India. This was actionable intelligence. It helped India. In fact, here is how one official described it, and I'm quoting again. They were waiting, and that's because the US had given India everything to be fully prepared for this. It demonstrates a test case of the success of how the two militaries are now cooperating and sharing intelligence. So India and the US are collaborating on security. They're working together in real time. And this is a pivotal shift. China is obviously not happy about this. One report described Beijing as being, quote unquote, enraged when they heard that the US had given intel to India. So long story short, this is a mutually beneficial partnership. India is getting better weapons and intelligence. America is getting a strategic partner against China. This is not to say that the relationship does not have limitations. There is still the baggage of the past and some skepticism, which the likes of Justin Trudeau would like to exploit. Unfortunately for them, success is unlikely. And speaking of military allies, Ukraine has just lost one, their neighbor and NATO member Poland. The breakup was brewing for a while now. It started when Poland banned the import of Ukrainian food grains. You see, Ukraine cannot export via sea. So they dumped their food grain in neighboring countries like Poland. But Poland said no more. Their farmers were losing out because of cheap Ukrainian grain. Kiev rejected this decision. They also filed a lawsuit at the World Trade Organization. Let me repeat that. A lawsuit against their own ally. Poland did not say very much about the legal action. But this week, President Zelensky went a step further. He crossed a red line during his speech at the United Nations General Assembly. Listen to this.
And it is alarming to see how some in Europe, some our friends in Europe, play out solidarity in political theater, making thriller from the grain. And they may seem to play their own role, but in fact, they are helping set the stage to a Moscow actor.
Big mistake there. Poland rejected Zelensky's statement. This is what their government said, and I'm quoting, "No one in the world has shown more generous help to Ukrainians than Poles. President Zelensky should remember this." In other words, show some gratitude. If the matter ended there, Ukraine would have been fine, but Poland was not done yet. Hours later, their prime minister announced a big decision. He said Poland would stop giving weapons to Ukraine.
We are not transferring any weapons to Ukraine because we are now aiming to defend ourselves with the most modern weapons. If you want to defend yourself, you have to have something to defend yourself with.
And this is massive. Poland has been one of Ukraine's biggest supporters. They have given military aid worth $3 billion. This includes 320 Soviet-era tanks, plus around 14 MiG fighter jets. But Poland says no more. Maybe other Western countries can plug this military gap. But the political gap? Highly unlikely. Poland is currently hosting 1.3 million Ukrainian refugees. They're lobbying for Ukraine's entry into NATO. Could this support also end? The signals are certainly not encouraging. Poland has spent around $16 billion to support refugees. $16 billion. They gave money for healthcare, education, housing. But the government says this aid will end in 2024, so no more financial support either. What explains this sudden U-turn by Poland? Well, Ukraine's lawsuit is just one reason. Another reason is Poland's domestic politics. Elections are due next month, and the ruling party is facing a lot of pressure. People are not so thrilled about hosting refugees anymore. Last year, around 91% of Poles supported welcoming Ukrainian refugees. And this year, it's fallen to 69%. So supporting Ukraine is not that popular anymore. Having said that, Kiev too must take the blame. They're still in this war because of their allies, because of the weapons they got. So what Zelensky did was a diplomatic blunder. First, he filed a lawsuit against Poland. Then he raised the issue at the United Nations. It's not surprising, though. Ukraine has made the same mistake with other countries, even India. Their foreign minister once said that India is buying Ukrainian blood. Why was that? Because New Delhi imported Russian oil. And recently, Zelensky's advisor also attacked India. He said India and China have quote-unquote weak intellectual potential. I guess he meant IQ. Kiev later rejected these comments. But you can see the broad trend. Now, we get that Ukraine is under a lot of pressure. They need all the support that they can get. But surely, such outbursts do not help. Plus, it's not like Ukraine has been isolated. NATO is very much behind them. And that support was on full display at the United Nations Security Council. Zelensky attended the UNSC meeting on Wednesday. His first in-person appearance there. Now, Albania is presiding over the council this month, the United Nations Security Council. They invited Zelensky to speak first, even before the permanent and non-permanent members. Russia objected to this. Listen to the exchange that followed.
We wanted to ask you on what basis you propose to give the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky the floor before members of the Security Council speak.
I want to assure our Russian colleagues and everyone here that this is not a special operation by the Albanian presidency.
We regret that the Albanian presidency has demonstrated a blatant disregard for consensual practices of the Security Council. They have placed their political and ideological beliefs above the obligations of the President of the Security Council.
I must say that coming from you, all this lecture of violating the rules in this building is quite an impressive shoot.
Some good comebacks there. But remember, this is the United Nations Security Council. Their job is to work for world peace. Instead, they're roasting each other. Zelensky did manage to speak eventually. He said that countries waging war should lose their veto power. In other words, Russia's veto should be taken away.
Any participation of the Security Council membership should be suspended for a period of time when such a state resorts to aggression against another nation in violation of the UN Charter.
All this talk led to nothing. The United Nations was Zelensky's chance to rally the world, to meet leaders and gain new allies. Instead, he will return from New York one ally short. What do you do when you meet an old friend? You give them a hug, you talk about the old times, you discuss the future. What is it that you do not do? Make them wait. But that's the story of the US and Israel right now. First, Joe Biden took forever to invite Netanyahu to America. When he finally did, Biden made him wait. This was in New York, on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. Netanyahu was invited to Biden's Intercontinental Hotel. But once he arrived, he had to wait. Biden was around 30 minutes late. Not a great start to a meeting after ages. But soon tensions gave way to some banter. Take a look at this exchange.
If you and I, 10 years ago, were talking about normalization with Saudi Arabia, and I think we'd look at each other like, who's been drinking what? But we're
Good Irish whiskey.
Good Irish whiskey. That's the reason why I've never had a drink. Any rate, so welcome, Bibi, and hope we can get some things settled today.
America and Israel have what they call the most special bilateral relationship. They're longtime allies and friends. Netanyahu became prime minister again last December. So in this stint, he's been in office for 9 months. But this is the first time that he's meeting Joe Biden. Why is that? Because Biden refused to engage with him. 2 reasons for that. Israel has a far-right government, and they're pushing for a controversial judicial overhaul. Biden is unhappy about both. So for 9 months, he did not meet Netanyahu. That's not a snub. I wonder what is. It is the longest an Israeli prime minister has gone without meeting the US president since 1964. So clearly, things were not well. But now the two seem to be mending fences, and they have a common cause. A normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, brokered by the United States.
I think that under your leadership, Mr. President, we can forge a historic peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I think such a peace would go a long way, first, to advance the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, achieve reconciliation between the Islamic world and the Jewish state, and advance a genuine peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This is something within our reach.
In 2020, Israel normalized ties with 3 Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. The Abraham Accords were a game changer. But normalizing ties with Saudi Arabia would be the deal of the century. It would change West Asia forever. I mean, these are 2 nations that have fought wars against each other. They do not share official ties, so a deal would be historic. And both sides sound optimistic about it.
There were reports that you had suspended talks.
No, that's not true.
Not true. So you think, if you were to characterize it, are you close?
Every day we get closer. It seems it's for the first time real one, serious. We're going to see how it goes.
We will see how it goes. That's what the Saudi Crown Prince has to say. So deal looks viable, but conditions apply. Saudi Arabia wants 3 things in exchange. 1, a US defense pact. 2, a civilian nuclear program. And 3, resolving the Palestinian issue. Now, for Israel and the US, the first 2 should be relatively easy. The third, if not handled well, could be a deal breaker.
There is approach from President Biden administration to get to that point. For us, the Palestinian issue is very important. We need to solve that part, and we have a good negotiations continue till now. We gotta see where it will go. We hope that it will reach a place that it will ease the life of the Palestinians and get Israel back, as a player in Middle East.
Israel currently has its most far-right government in history, so concessions to Palestine are a big no-no. But that's on Benjamin Netanyahu. If he wants a deal, he will have to convince his partners. The other hurdle is Palestine itself. They call the Abraham Accords a betrayal. But this time, they have changed tactics. Palestine has presented Saudi Arabia with a list of demands that they want Riyadh to make on their behalf. Now, they may or may not get what they want, but it won't be for want of trying. And they're not alone. There's another West Asian nation that is rallying for Palestine.
We believe relations with the Zionist regime with regional countries is a stab in the back to the Palestinian people and the resistance of the Palestinians.
Palestine isn't calling it a stab in the back, at least not yet. But Tehran is not mincing words. And why should it? Iran and Saudi Arabia had been enemies for a long time. They've recently repaired ties, but they're still suspicious of each other. In fact, MBS was asked about Iran's nuclear program, and he had only one thing to say. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will get one too.
If they get one, we have to get one for security reasons and for balancing power in the Middle East, but we don't want to see that.
Well, that's West Asia for you. The sands shift, foes turn into friends, and alliances change. As they say in politics, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. Meanwhile, Syria's president is in China. That's right, Bashar al-Assad is traveling. He landed in China's Hangzhou today. The Chinese media is busy building suspense. You have to hear this. Assad's plane landed amid heavy fog at the airport. Chinese media says it added to the atmosphere of mystery. We disagree, though. There is nothing mysterious about Assad's visit to China. In fact, it's all very obvious. China has been supporting Assad in the Syrian civil war, not military support, political support. They have vetoed 8 resolutions against Syria at the United Nations Security Council. So China is one of Assad's few friends. This visit is all about building on that. China is hosting the upcoming Asian Games. The opening ceremony is on Saturday. Assad, along with other leaders, will attend it. And for the Syrian president, that's a big deal. He was an international pariah for 10 years. He was kicked out of the Arab League. So to share the stage at the Asian Games is symbolic, which is why China invited him to reintroduce Assad on the world stage, to give him some legitimacy. Assad is expected to hold talks with President Xi Jinping. China says the meeting will take relations to new heights.
President Xi and other Chinese leaders will meet with him to have an in-depth exchange of views on bilateral relations and issues of common concern. We believe that President Bashar al-Assad's visit will further deepen mutual trust and cooperation in various fields between the two countries and push bilateral relations to a new level.
Assad last visited China in 2004. That's more than 18 years ago. Since then, a lot has changed. For starters, he doesn't control his entire country. Kurdish fighters hold Syria's lucrative oil fields. But that has not stopped Xi Jinping. His strategy is to extend China's influence to West Asia. So far, he's had 2 successes. One, the deal with Iran. China has promised to invest over $400 billion over 25 years in Iran. And 2, the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal. China got these 2 rivals to normalize relations. No one saw it coming. Could Syria be Xi Jinping's next target? Well, politically, it does make sense. The Arab countries have reinstated Assad in the Arab League. It's only the West that is still opposing him. The US and Europe want to impose more sanctions on Syria. So Assad and Xi have that in common. They both hate the West, but financially, will it make sense? On paper, yes, it does. But Syria's security situation raises some questions. Let me explain why I say this. The civil war has devastated Syria. So reconstruction is their top priority. And how much will that cost? Between $400 billion and $1 trillion, these are the estimates, and that's a lot of contracts and deals. Chinese companies would love to get involved. Also, Syria has oil. In 2008, China invested $3 billion in Syria's energy industry. Unfortunately for them, war broke out. Beijing will be keen to continue where they left. So Syria is a key opportunity for China, a regime that hates the West, a leader in need of money and friends, and a country poised for reconstruction. Assad has already signaled his support for China. Last year, he signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is where Syria's location is also a big plus. Look at the map. Syria is located between Iraq and Turkey. Iraq is a major oil producer and Turkey is the gateway from Asia to Europe. So Syria could play a key role in China's BRI. But do not expect quick progress, because the security situation is still a problem. You see, Syria's civil war is frozen, but it's not over. Assad controls around 70% of the country. The rest is controlled by opposition forces. So violence is less, but it's not unheard of. And China will be wary of that, of investing big money in a war zone. But Assad's mission is to allay those fears. He has multiple meetings lined up across China. He's being accompanied by a high-ranking delegation. It's a visit very high on symbolism. Let's see if the results match that. Now to Iran. The powerful men in their government are at it again, targeting women, curbing their freedoms. Yesterday, Iran's parliament approved a new bill, a hijab and chastity bill. It sounds as oppressive as it sounds. It severely punishes violations of Iran's dress code. Not wearing a hijab could now mean a jail term for up to 10 years. 10 years over a dress code violation. And look at the timing. This comes about a year after the death of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old who was killed over a hijab because she was apparently not wearing it properly. That set off protests across Iran. People wanted freedom from this oppression. And what did their leaders do? They doubled down. Here's a report.
It's been just over a year since Iran was engulfed in protests. Protests that began with the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. She died on the 16th of September last year. She died after being detained by Iran's notorious morality police. Her crime? Not wearing her hijab properly, apparently. Amini's death set off some of the biggest protests Iran had seen. People marched through the streets chanting, "Woman, life, freedom." So now the politicians of Iran have decided to crush women's lives and freedom even further. Yesterday, Iran's parliament passed the Hijab and Chastity Bill. It's as though the previous punishments for violating dress restrictions have been given sanctimonious steroids. And what are these restrictions? Women above the age of puberty have to cover up. Their hair must be hidden behind a hijab. Nothing below the neck should be seen, nor anything above the ankle. Forearm exposure is allowed, but nothing above that. Clothing should neither be revealing nor tight-fitting. Loose and long-fitting clothing obscuring one's figure is preferred. These are the rules. They remain the same as before. They are based on Iran's official interpretation of Sharia law. Iran's clerics imposed these restrictions. The public has to obey. They have no choice.
If anyone for any reason does not have a strong belief in the hijab, the obligation to follow the law is still what creates a lawful society.
So what does the new law change? It's the punishment for breaking the dress restrictions that's been increased. Earlier, Iranian women could face 10 days to 2 months in jail for breaking these rules. Now, prison time can go up 5 to 10 years. There's a monetary fine component as well. Earlier, it was between 5,000 to $500,000 Iranian rials. That's around 12 cents to $12. Now the fine will be between 180 million and 360 million rials. That's about 4,200 to 8,500 US dollars. It has increased 700-fold. The new punishments are nothing short of draconian. The new bill also compels government, law enforcement and military organizations to enforce the mandatory hijab law. Businesses will also be prosecuted for encouraging nudity, lack of chastity or bad covering in any way. There are also fines for promoting nudity or making fun of the hijab in the media and on social networks. Violating the dress code in an organized manner, such as during protests like those seen last year, could lead to 10 years in jail. Basically, the new law is a hammer to any dissent against the hijab. Iran's new hijab and chastity bill was passed by the country's parliament yesterday. It wasn't a unanimous decision, but most lawmakers wanted it passed. 152 voted in favour, 34 against, and 7 abstained. Only about 6% of Iran's parliamentarians are women, so these harsh new punishments were designed by men. A few did oppose the new bill.
We believe in an appropriate Islamic dress code in society. We have to have the necessary rules, and those who do not obey those rules or attempted to disrupt the community should be punished. But this bill is not the one we are in need of. The appropriate dress code regulation that we have in mind has a logical social support. This bill is not what we are looking for.
But the moderates were shut down and the hardliners passed the crushing new law. The bill isn't a permanent law yet. It still needs to be approved by Iran's Guardian Council. But these 12 men appointed by the clerics are likely to pass it. The only upside is it will initially be for a trial period of 3 years. If there's enough pushback, it may get withdrawn after that period elapses. But with Iran's regime tightening its grip, how much scope is there really left for any pushback?
Now we'll talk about grand theft, not the usual bank robberies or car or jewel heists. We'll be talking about the theft of liquid gold in Spain. Almost $500,000 worth of it. Before we continue, we should clarify, when we say liquid gold, we mean it in the agricultural sense. We're talking about olive oil. It's being stolen in Spain. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of olive oil is being stolen, and Spain is the world's largest producer of it. But a long period of drought has hit production. As supplies dwindle, prices have risen, and thieves are now eyeing the lucrative liquid. They're robbing olive oil factories and carting off thousands of liters of oil. Our next report has more on this slick story.
There's a spree of thefts in Spain. Across the nation, bandits are on the prowl. Their target? Olive oil. There have been plenty of small-scale robberies over the months, but lately the thieves have gotten more ambitious. They've begun robbing olive oil factories. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of olive oil have been looted. Factories near Malaga and Cordoba have been robbed of thousands of liters of the golden liquid. Or liquid gold, depending on who you ask. Now the big question is, of course, why? Why are heist targets switching from money to olive oil? The reason is simple. The oil is getting scarce and therefore valuable. Olive oil prices have shot up, particularly in the past year. And Spain has been hit especially hard. The country is the world's largest producer of olive oil. But for the last 3 years, it has been facing drought-like conditions in the olive-growing belt. This has seen production plummet and prices soar.
We are very dependent on olive trees and the cultivation of oil. Therefore, when the land stops receiving water, it is an economic catastrophe.
We are also seeing that temperatures are changing. We have heat waves with temperatures of 42 or 43 degrees for 10 days, and that is also exhausting a lot the olive trees. The water stress they are suffering is so much stronger.
Those were predictions made last year, and they have come true. Spain's olive oil production is suffering due to both drought and heat waves. The average temperature in Spain is about 1.3 degrees Celsius higher than average, and that has put severe stress on the country's olive output. Last year, output fell by about 6.4%. This year, it's about half the usual harvest, down to about 610,000 tons compared to the usual 1.3 million tons. And that has sent prices shooting up by over 100%. In Spain's Andalusia region, olive oil prices have hit $9 per kilogram. It's a year-on-year jump of 111%. Pause for a bit and think about all your investments. Stocks, fixed deposits, gold or whatever else. How many give a return of 111% in a year? So is it really any surprise that thieves think Spain's liquid gold is worth a fortune? This is oil we're talking about. It will last a long time. They can keep selling it slowly and making a fortune. After all, everyone in Spain needs olive oil to cook with. It really isn't the worst business plan. And we know why this is really happening. Climate change. It's now coming for your extra virgin, extra healthy cooking aid as well. It seems we humans have burnt so much oil that nature isn't allowing us to make cooking oil now. At least not in the same places. Spain is definitely losing out on its traditional specialty, as are other olive oil producers like Greece and Italy. If nothing is done and the world keeps heating up, Spanish olive oil will be a thing of the past. Temperature belts will shift upwards, and tomorrow we'll have to depend on German or British olive oil instead. Can you imagine? Olive oil from Cardiff instead of Cordoba. It might happen sooner than you think if we don't do enough to tackle climate change.
Our last story tonight is about a man called Philip Paxson, a medical device salesman and father of two from North Carolina in the US. Last year, this month, he was driving home after his daughter's 9th birthday party at a friend's house. He was in an unfamiliar neighborhood. It was dark and raining, so he relied on Google Maps for directions. You know, Google's web mapping platform. The app directed Paxson to cross a bridge, but he drove off its unguarded edge and crashed about 20 feet below. He drowned and died. You see, Paxson was trying to cross what's called the Bridge to Nowhere. It had collapsed a decade ago, but the Google map was not updated. And now Paxson's family has sued Google for negligence. So is Google to blame for what happened? Is this the first time it has dangerously misdirected someone? Our next report tells you.
Google was birthed in 1998, and since then it has revolutionized how people find information online. In the decades since, it has amassed billions of users. A large number of them the world over use this service, Google Maps. It was launched in 2005, and it tells us where we are and where we're going. Not spiritually, of course. Today, it's used by over 1 billion people every month. They turn to the service to find their way to cafes, to friends' birthday parties, and to look up nearby monuments. How does Google know the lay of the land? It uses a bunch of tools to draw up its maps. It collects data from a combination of satellite imagery, street photography, and user-generated data. The last bit is where a user tells Google if the road to her home is under construction, or if there's traffic on the street, even if a local business is shifting locations. According to Google, its maps are updated constantly, every second of every day. But that doesn't mean Google updates everything. And sometimes this can lead to a tragedy. Like in the case of this bridge. It's called the Bridge to Nowhere, because quite literally, it's just that. The bridge collapsed a decade ago, but this information was not updated on Google Maps. And last year, Philip Paxson bore the brunt of this. Paxson was a medical device salesman and father of two from North Carolina. He was driving back home in his truck after winding up his daughter's 9th birthday party at a friend's place. He was driving in an unfamiliar neighborhood. It was dark and raining, so he used Google Maps to lead him home. But the app directed him to this bridge, told him to cross it, and he fell off its unguarded edge. He crashed about 20 feet below into the creek, and Paxson drowned to death. And according to the suit, it was Google's responsibility to mention that it hadn't been. How has Google reacted to the incident? Currently, it's reviewing the allegations, saying that Google's goal is to provide accurate routing information. But here's the thing. Sometimes it isn't as accurate as Google may want it to be. Philip Paxson isn't the first person whose death has been tied to Google Maps. In 2020, an 18-year-old Russian froze to death. The boy and his friend were stranded in this vehicle for a week. Google Maps sent them on a disused shortcut in the world's coldest inhabited region. It's called the Road of Bones. Now, death is the worst-case scenario, but Google Maps regularly and dangerously misdirects users. In 2019, a truck driver in Indonesia drove off a cliff. He followed Google Maps on a route meant for motorcycles. Last month, a woman in Australia nosedived into a ditch after following the service. There are similar cases everywhere. The question is it entirely Google's fault? Well, the jury is still out on that. Some say Google is a free tool, merely meant for reference, and it holds no responsibility. Then there are others who claim that people's dependence on the service is increasing, so the app must be held accountable. After all, one doesn't let social media apps get off the hook for misinformation simply because they're free to use. While we wait for the court decision in the Philip Paxson case, in the meantime, we'll say, use Google Maps, but use your discretion. Because sometimes the road not taken does make all the difference between life and death.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Brigitte Macron and Queen Camilla practiced some ping-pong diplomacy as the French First Lady took on the UK royal in a table tennis match. In Chile's military parade, the Canine Brigade stole the show. Puppies marched proudly alongside their dedicated handlers. In Thailand, an unusually dense plankton bloom off the coast is creating an aquatic dead zone. And finally, we're taking you back in history on this day. In 1949, Manipur merged with the Indian Union. It used to be an independent princely state. After gaining independence, India started integrating 500 princely states into the country. Manipur became a part of India 2 years after independence. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Hoy estos perritos se presentan en brazos de los carabineros para encontrar un hogar y ser parte de una familia. Hoy se despiden. El día de mañana ellos pasarán a retiro.